The sun beat down mercilessly on the desolate plain of Tarnak 4, a barren wasteland orbiting a pale blue star. The air shimmered with heat, and dust devils swirled lazily across the cracked earth. In the shadow of a ruined colonial outpost, Sergeant Kyle Moran stood at the edge of a makeshift trench, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a grimy hand. His squad, a ragtag band of human fighters, crouched in silence around him, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The oppressive silence was shattered by the sharp whine of engines overhead. Kyle tilted his head, squinting against the glare of the twin suns as sleek Imperial drop ships sliced through the sky like silver blades. The Galactic Empire had come to crush the last remnants of human resistance on Tarnak 4. But Kyle wasn't worried about the drop ships, not yet anyway. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the ancient, rusted contraption that stood in the center of their defensive line. It was a crude, barrel-shaped machine, its multiple gun barrels pointing forward like the teeth of a snarling beast. Most of the squad had dismissed it as a piece of scrap metal when they first saw it. Kyle, however, saw potential. "It's a Gatling gun," he'd explained to his skeptical soldiers, running a hand over the worn brass housing. "Hundreds of years old. A relic from Earth's past. But if we can get it running, it'll punch through anything the Empire throws at us." The others hadn't shared his enthusiasm. Corporal Jace Maddox, a wiry man with a perpetual scowl, had been the first to voice his doubts. "You're telling me this antique is going to hold off an army of shock troopers with plasma rifles? You've lost it, Sarge." Kyle had simply grinned. "Stick around, Maddox. You might learn a thing or two about Earth's history." Now, as the sound of the approaching ships grew louder, the squad's skepticism was giving way to nervous anticipation. Maddox shifted uneasily in his spot, his hands tightening on his rifle. Private Sarah Vega, the youngest member of the squad, stared at the Gatling gun with wide eyes, as if it were some ancient artifact come to life. "You sure this thing's gonna work, Sarge?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Kyle gave her a reassuring nod. "If it doesn't, we're dead anyway. So let's make it work." The gun itself was a miracle of old-world engineering. Built in the late 19th century on Earth, the Gatling gun was a precursor to the automatic weapons of today. Its rotating barrels were designed to deliver a continuous stream of bullets with devastating efficiency. It was primitive by modern standards, but Kyle knew it had one critical advantage. It didn't rely on the high-tech energy systems the Empire's forces depended on. It was simple, mechanical, and brutally effective. The only problem was getting it operational. Kyle knelt beside the weapon, his hands moving quickly as he made final adjustments. He'd spent the last 3 days salvaging parts from the outpost's ruins, scavenging anything that could be repurposed to restore the gun to working order. It hadn't been easy, but now, as he cranked the weapon's handle, he felt a surge of satisfaction as the barrels began to spin smoothly. "She's ready," Kyle said, his voice firm. "Maddox, Vega, cover me. The rest of you stay low and wait for my signal." The squad nodded, their faces grim. They didn't need to be told how high the stakes were. The Empire didn't take prisoners. As the first drop ship descended, its landing gear kicking up a cloud of dust, Kyle braced himself. The craft's hatch hissed open, and a squad of Imperial shock troopers marched out in perfect formation. Clad in gleaming silver armor and armed with plasma rifles, they looked more like machines than men. Their movements were precise, their expressions cold and unyielding. The Imperial commander, a tall figure with a flowing black cape, surveyed the human defenses with a sneer. "Pathetic," he muttered, his voice amplified by the helmet's comm system. "Is this the best Earth has to offer? Scrambling in the dirt with relics from the past?" Kyle gritted his teeth, forcing himself to remain calm. He could feel the tension in the trench as his squad waited for his command. The Empire's forces had underestimated them, as they always did. To the Imperials, humans were little more than a nuisance, a backward species clinging to outdated traditions. But they didn't know Earth's history. They didn't know what humanity was capable of when pushed to the brink. The commander raised a hand, signaling his troops to advance. The shock troopers moved forward, their boots crunching against the rocky ground. Plasma rifles hummed to life, their glowing barrels aimed squarely at the trench. Kyle's hand tightened on the Gatling gun's crank. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. The Empire thought they were facing a broken, desperate band of rebels. They had no idea what was about to hit them. "Now?" Kyle shouted, his voice cutting through the din. The Gatling gun roared to life. The sound was deafening, a rapid, thunderous barrage that echoed across the plain. The rotating barrels spat out a relentless stream of bullets, tearing through the ranks of the advancing shock troopers. The Imperials were caught completely off guard, their formation breaking as the unexpected hail of projectiles shredded their armor. Maddox let out a triumphant yell, his rifle adding to the cacophony as he picked off stragglers. Vega fired in quick, controlled bursts, her aim steady despite the chaos. The rest of the squad joined in, their weapons blazing as they poured fire into the stunned Imperial forces. The commander shouted orders, his voice rising in panic as he tried to rally his troops. But it was no use. The Gatling gun was a force of nature, an unstoppable wall of lead that chewed through anything in its path. The Empire's advanced technology was useless against the sheer, unrelenting firepower of the ancient weapon. Within minutes, the battlefield was littered with the broken bodies of shock troopers. The remaining Imperials fell back, retreating toward their drop ship in disarray. Kyle kept the Gatling gun spinning, ensuring they wouldn't regroup. He didn't stop until the last of the Empire's forces had fled, leaving the plain silent once more. As the dust settled, the squad emerged from the trench, their faces a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. Maddox let out a low whistle, shaking his head as he stared at the smoking Gatling gun. "Okay, Sarge," he said, a grudging smile tugging at his lips. "You were right. That thing's a beast." Kyle allowed himself a small grin, though his expression quickly turned serious. "This was just the first wave," he said. "The Empire won't take this loss lightly. They'll be back and they'll bring reinforcements." Vega glanced at the horizon, her brow furrowing. "What do we do when they come back?" Kyle placed a hand on the Gatling gun, his grip firm. "We fight. With everything we've got. And we show them that humanity isn't just some relic of the past." The squad nodded, their resolve hardening. They had survived the first onslaught, but the battle was far from over. The Empire had mocked Earth's old technology, dismissing it as outdated and irrelevant. But they had learned a harsh lesson today: even relics from the past could still bite. And Kyle Moran intended to make sure they never forgot it. The brief lull in battle felt unnatural, like the eye of a storm. Kyle Moran and his squad stood in silence, their eyes scanning the horizon as they braced for the inevitable retaliation. The scorching winds of Tarnak swept through the trench, carrying the acrid scent of burnt metal and scorched earth. The battlefield was littered with the remains of the Empire's first wave, shattered armor, smoking plasma rifles and blood-soaked soil. But Kyle knew this victory was only a prelude. The Galactic Empire was not known for leniency, nor for underestimating an opponent twice. Their hubris had led to their first failure, but they would adapt. The next wave would be larger, deadlier, and far less forgiving. "Keep your heads down and stay sharp," Kyle ordered, his voice cutting through the uneasy quiet. "This isn't over." Maddox leaned against the trench wall, his rifle resting across his knees. "You think they're regrouping, Sarge? Or maybe they're licking their wounds and heading back to whatever star cruiser dropped them off?" Kyle shot him a grim look. "The Empire doesn't lick its wounds. They retaliate, fast and hard. Count on it." As if on cue, a low rumble filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Kyle's jaw tightened as he glanced skyward. The shimmering atmosphere of Tarnak 4 distorted the view, but the unmistakable silhouette of a heavy assault carrier emerged through the heat haze. Unlike the sleek dropships from earlier, this craft was a hulking behemoth, bristling with weapons and reinforced with thick plating. It hovered menacingly above the battlefield, its shadow stretching across the desolate plain like a predator preparing to strike. The squad tensed, their chatter falling silent. Even Maddox, who was rarely short on sarcastic remarks, swallowed hard as he stared at the incoming threat. "Looks like they brought the big guns," Vega muttered, gripping her rifle tightly. Kyle adjusted his grip on the Gatling gun's crank, his expression steely. "And we've got ours. Get into position. Now." The squad scrambled to reinforce their defenses. Sandbags were hastily stacked, firing lines established, and every available weapon was checked and rechecked. Kyle remained by the Gatling gun, his hands moving over the ancient weapon with practiced ease. He had already refilled its hopper with the last of their salvaged ammunition, knowing full well that once it ran out, they'd have little else to rely on. As the assault carrier descended, the sound of its engines roared like thunder, drowning out all other noise. Kyle could see movement along the edges of its hull, dozens of figures disembarking from drop pods, their forms illuminated by the carrier's fiery thrusters. This wasn't a mere squad of shock troopers. It was an entire platoon. Imperial heavy infantry. The first wave had been clad in sleek, standard-issue armor designed for mobility and precision. These troops, however, were a different breed altogether. They lumbered across the battlefield in bulky exocets, their movements accompanied by the mechanical hiss of hydraulic servos. Their armor was thick and imposing, reinforced with energy shielding that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Each soldier carried a massive plasma repeater, a weapon capable of cutting through fortified positions like a hot knife through butter. "Shielded infantry," Maddox hissed, his voice barely audible over the din. "Fantastic. Like this couldn't get any worse." "They think shields make them invincible," Kyle said, his tone measured. "We'll see how they hold up against kinetic force." The Imperial commander from earlier appeared at the head of the formation, his black cape billowing dramatically as he raised a hand to halt his troops. His voice boomed across the battlefield, amplified by the carrier's external speakers. "Humans of Tarnak, for your defiance ends here. Surrender now and you will be spared." Kyle couldn't help but smirk. "Spared? That's rich." Vega crouched beside him, glancing nervously at the approaching force. "What's the plan, Sarge?" Kyle didn't hesitate. "We hold this line. They've brought shields, but those exosuits are bulky, makes them slow. We keep them at range and use the terrain to our advantage." "And the Gatling gun?" Maddox asked, his tone tinged with doubt. "Will it even dent that armor?" Kyle met his gaze, his expression resolute. "It'll do more than dent it. Trust me." The Imperial commander gave a final signal, and the assault began. The heavy infantry advanced in a methodical phalanx, their shields absorbing the scattered potshots from the human defenders. Plasma bolts lit up the battlefield, searing through the air with deadly precision. Kyle's squad returned fire, but their rifles were woefully inadequate against the Imperial's reinforced exosuits. Kyle waited, his hands steady on the Gatling gun's crank. Timing was everything. If he fired too soon, the enemy would adapt, using their shields to deflect the incoming rounds. He needed them to close the gap just enough for their confidence to falter. Just enough to catch them off guard. "Hold," Kyle murmured, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "Hold." The first wave of infantry reached the outer edge of the trench, their plasma repeaters glowing ominously as they prepared to unleash a devastating volley. Kyle took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "Now," he shouted. The Gatling gun erupted with a deafening roar, its rotating barrels spitting a relentless hail of bullets. The sound was a thunderous, mechanical cacophony that drowned out the screams of the advancing troops. The first line of heavy infantry staggered as the kinetic impact of the rounds slammed into their shields. Sparks flew as the bullets shattered the energy barriers, punching through the exosuits beneath. One by one the Imperial soldiers fell, their armor crumpling like tin under the withering assault. The Gatling gun's rate of fire was relentless, its ancient design proving more effective than anyone could have anticipated. Unlike energy weapons, which the shields were calibrated to deflect, the Gatling gun's physical projectiles overwhelmed the Imperial's defenses through sheer brute force. Maddox let out an incredulous laugh, his rifle joining the fray. "They're dropping like flies?" The squad rallied, their confidence surging as they watched the once imposing heavy infantry crumble under the Gatling gun's fire. Even Vega, who had been on the verge of panic moments ago, grinned as she fired shot after shot into the disoriented ranks of the enemy. The Imperial commander, still standing at the rear of the formation, watched in stunned silence as his carefully orchestrated assault fell apart. His troops, so confident in their technological superiority, were being decimated by an antiquated weapon, a relic from a bygone era. "Fall back," he barked, his voice laced with desperation. "Regroup at the carrier." The surviving Imperials began to retreat, their disciplined formation dissolving into chaos as they scrambled to escape the Gatling gun's relentless barrage. Kyle didn't let up, his hands steady on the crank as he mowed down the fleeing troops. He didn't stop until the last soldier had disappeared into the carrier's hull. As the assault carrier began to lift off, its engines roaring to life, Kyle finally released the crank L, letting the Gatling gun fall silent. The battlefield was eerily quiet once more, the only sounds the distant hum of the departing ship and the labored breathing of his squad. Maddox turned to Kyle, his face split in a wide grin. "Sarge, remind me never to doubt you again." Kyle allowed himself a small smile, though his expression remained serious. "This was just round 2, he said. "The Empire isn't done with us yet." Vega glanced nervously at the horizon. "What do you think they'll send next?" Kyle's gaze hardened as he looked toward the sky. "Something bigger. Something nastier. But it doesn't matter. We've got history on our side." The squad cheered, their spirits bolstered by the decisive victory. But Kyle knew better than to celebrate prematurely. The Empire would be back, and when they returned they would bring the full weight of their wrath. But Kyle Moran and his Gatling gun would be ready. You said. The sky over Tarnak 4 turned a bruised shade of purple as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The squad huddled in the trench, their adrenaline-fueled victory over the heavy infantry now tempered by grim anticipation. The Empire wasn't known for accepting defeat lightly, and Kyle Moran could feel the weight of the coming storm pressing down on them. A faint tremor ran through the ground, so subtle at first that the squad barely noticed. Then it came again, stronger this time, followed by another and another. The vibrations built into a rhythmic pounding, like the drumbeat of an unstoppable march. What now? Maddox muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. His usual sarcasm had evaporated, replaced by a growing unease. Kyle peered over the edge of the trench, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. It didn't take long to spot the source of the tremors. A line of massive war machines emerged from the shimmering heat, their imposing forms silhouetted against the fading light. These were Imperial battle walkers, towering quadrupeds bristling with weaponry and armor thick enough to shrug off most conventional attacks. "Aves," Vega whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're done for." "Not yet, we're not," Kyle said firmly, though even he felt a pang of doubt as he watched the walkers advance. Each step of their heavy legs sent up clouds of dust, and the ground seemed to shudder beneath their immense weight. They moved with deliberate precision, their mounted cannons swiveling to scan the terrain. The lead walker stopped abruptly, its turret locking onto the trench. A loudspeaker crackled to life, and the cold, imperious voice of the Imperial commander echoed across the battlefield. "You've had your fun, humans. But this game is over. Surrender now and I might grant you a merciful end." Kyle stepped out of the trench, his hands resting on the crank of the Gatling gun. He shouted back, his voice ringing clear despite the distance. "Merciful? Like the way you've spared every other colony you've stomped on? Save your breath, Commander. We're not going anywhere." The commander's response was immediate. "So be it." The walkers opened fire. The night lit up with streaks of plasma and explosive shells as the Imperial war machines unleashed their full arsenal. The trench shook violently as the ground around it erupted in fiery blasts, forcing the squad to duck for cover. The air was filled with the deafening roar of cannon fire and the sharp, acrid smell of ozone. Kyle didn't flinch. His hands were already in motion, cranking the Gatling gun to life. The ancient weapon roared once more, its barrel spinning as it unleashed a torrent of lead toward the nearest walker. The bullet struck the machine's thick armor with a series of metallic clangs, some ricocheting harmlessly while others bit deeper, leaving pockmarks and dents. "It's not enough," Vega shouted over the noise. "We're barely scratching them. Keep firing." Kyle barked. "Aim for the joints." The squad followed his lead, their rifles targeting the walker's legs. Sparks flew as bullets struck hydraulic pistons and exposed servos, but the machines continued their advance, undeterred by the assault. One of the walkers lowered its turret, firing a burst of plasma that scorched the earth mere meters from the trench. "Fall back," Maddox yelled, panic creeping into his voice. "We can't hold this position." Kyle shook his head. "If we fall back we lose the Gatling gun, and this fight. Hold the line." As he spoke, his eyes darted to the outpost's ruins behind them. Amid the crumbling structures and scattered debris, a faint glint of metal caught his attention. He squinted, his mind racing as he recognized the shape, an old artillery shell half buried in the dirt. A plan began to form in his mind, reckless and desperate but better than waiting to be obliterated. He turned to Vega, who was reloading her rifle with trembling hands. "Vega, I need you to grab that shell in the ruins. Now." "What?" she exclaimed, her eyes wide. "You can't be serious. That thing's ancient, it might blow us up before we can even use it." Kyle's gaze hardened. "Do you trust me?" Vega hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. "I'll get it." She sprinted toward the ruins, dodging explosions and incoming fire with a speed and agility that belied her fear. Kyle turned back to the Gatling gun, pouring round after round into the lead walker. Its armor was visibly damaged now, with smoke and sparks pouring from its joints, but it still lumbered forward, its turret swiveling ominously toward the trench. "Come on," Kyle muttered under his breath, cranking the gun harder. "Come on, you bastard." Vega returned moments later, clutching the artillery shell like it was a live grenade. Her face was pale and sweat dripped from her brow, but her grip was steady as she handed the shell to Kyle. "What now?" she asked, breathless. Kyle examined the shell, noting the faded markings and the corroded casing. It was an old high-explosive round, likely left behind by the original colonists who had abandoned Tarnak for decades ago. He grabbed a length of detonation cord from his pack, wrapping it around the shell and tying it off with practiced efficiency. "We're going to give them a taste of their own medicine," Kyle said, his voice grim. "Maddox, cover me. Vega, you're with me?" The two soldiers nodded, their doubt giving way to determination. Together, they heaved the shell onto a makeshift sled, a piece of sheet metal scavenged from the ruins, and began hauling it toward the center of the battlefield. Plasma bolts sizzled past them, and the ground shook with every step of the advancing walkers, but they pressed on, driven by sheer will. When they reached a shallow depression in the earth, Kyle stopped, motioning for Vega to stand back. He carefully set the shell in place, positioning it directly in the path of the lead walker. Then he connected the detonation cord to a remote trigger, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision. "Get back to the trench," Kyle ordered. "I'll finish this." "What about you?" Vega asked, her voice trembling. "I'll be right behind you," Kyle lied. "Go?" Vega hesitated, then turned and ran, her footsteps fading into the chaos of battle. Kyle stayed behind, crouched low as he waited for the lead walker to close the gap. The massive machine loomed over him now, its shadow swallowing him whole. He could see the faint glow of its targeting systems as they locked onto the trench. "Come on," Kyle muttered, his thumb hovering over the trigger. "Just a little closer." The walker's foot came down with a thunderous crash inches from the shell. Kyle pressed the trigger. The explosion was blinding, a fiery blast that engulfed the walker in a plume of smoke and debris. The force of the detonation knocked Kyle off his feet, sending him sprawling across the dirt. When he looked up, his ears ringing, he saw the walker collapse in a heap of twisted metal, its legs sheared off by the blast. Cheers erupted from the trench as the squad watched the massive machine topple. But their victory was short-lived. The remaining walkers adjusted their formation, their turrets swiveling toward the trench. Kyle staggered to his feet, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. He grabbed his rifle, his mind racing as he prepared for the final stand. The battle wasn't over yet. The Imperial walkers regrouped, their movements slow but deliberate as they adjusted their formation. The loss of the lead walker had rattled them. Even the Empire's cold efficiency couldn't fully mask their hesitance. But hesitation didn't mean retreat. The remaining three machines pushed forward, their cannons swiveling to target the trench and the ragged defenders within it. Kyle Moran wiped the blood from his face, his head still spinning from the explosion. His squad was battered but unbroken, their cheers from the downed walker now replaced by grim resolve. Maddox leaned over the trench wall, firing his rifle at the nearest machine in a futile attempt to slow it down. Vega crouched beside him, her eyes darting between Kyle and the advancing war machines. "What's the plan now, Sarge?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Kyle tightened his grip on the rifle in his hands. His body ached from the blast and his ears still rang, but his mind remained sharp. "We're not out yet," he said, though he could feel the weight of their dwindling options pressing down on him. "We've still got one more surprise." Maddox glanced over his shoulder. "Sarge, if you've got some miracle in your back pocket, now's the time to share it." Kyle didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scanned the battlefield, his eyes locking onto the ruined outpost behind them. Among the wreckage, he spotted the faint outline of an old generator station. It was a relic of the colony's early days, back when Tarnak 4 had been a bustling mining hub. Kyle's mind raced, piecing together a desperate plan. "We need to draw them in closer," Kyle said finally. "Right up to the outpost." Maddox frowned. "Closer? Are you insane? Those things will tear us apart before we even—" "Do you trust me?" Kyle interrupted, his voice firm. Maddox hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Sarge. I trust you." Kyle nodded back. "Good." Vega, Maddox, fall back to the generator station. Use the ruins for cover and keep firing to draw their attention. "I'll cover you." "What about the Gatling gun?" Vega asked, her voice rising. "We're out of ammo and that thing was our only real chance." Kyle glanced at the ancient weapon, now silent and spent, its barrel still faintly warm from the relentless assault it had delivered. "Its job is done," he said simply. "Now it's our turn." Vega didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. She and Maddox began their retreat, firing in controlled bursts as they moved toward the outpost. The walkers' turrets tracked them, plasma bolts scorching the ground dangerously close to their heels. Kyle stayed behind for a moment longer, laying down suppressive fire with his rifle to buy them time. When the two soldiers reached the generator station, Kyle followed, sprinting through the ruins as the walkers closed in. The ground shook beneath their massive footsteps, each one a grim reminder of the Empire's overwhelming power. But Kyle wasn't focused on their size or their firepower. He was focused on the generator. The machine was a rusted hulk, its outer casing pitted with age and corrosion. But it still hummed faintly, a testament to its robust design. Kyle crouched beside it, inspecting the exposed wiring and controls. "What are you doing?" Vega asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and desperation. Kyle didn't look up. This old generator was built to power the entire outpost. It's a fusion reactor, small but strong enough to deliver a hell of a punch if we overload it. Maddox's eyes widened. "You're gonna turn it into a bomb?" Kyle nodded grimly. "Exactly. We need to lure those walkers right on top of it and detonate it. The blast should be strong enough to take them all out." "That's suicide," Vega exclaimed. "You'll never make it out in time." Kyle finally looked up, meeting her gaze. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop them here, they'll level this entire colony. This is our last shot." Vega's hands tightened around her rifle, her knuckles white. She wanted to argue, but the determination in Kyle's eyes silenced her. She nodded reluctantly. "What do you need us to do?" "Keep them distracted," Kyle said. "Draw their fire but don't get too close. I'll handle the rest." Maddox grinned, though it was more grim than cheerful. "Just like old times, huh, Sarge?" Kyle managed a small smile. "Yeah, just like old times." The two soldiers moved into position, using the ruins to keep the walkers' attention focused on them. Plasma bolts rained down, scorching the outpost and sending up plumes of smoke and dust. Kyle worked quickly, his hands moving over the generator's controls with practiced precision. He rerouted power, bypassed safety protocols, and connected the detonation cord he had salvaged earlier. The generator's hum grew louder, its internal system struggling to contain the energy Kyle was forcing through it. The lights on its control panel flickered wildly, a clear sign that it was reaching critical overload. The walkers were almost on top of them now, their massive forms towering over the ruins. Kyle could feel the heat of their plasma cannons as they fired, the air shimmering with deadly energy. He finished rigging the generator and stepped back, holding the remote trigger in his hand. "Fall back," he shouted to Vega and Maddox. "Get clear?" The two soldiers didn't hesitate. They retreated toward the trench, their movements swift and deliberate. The walkers, unaware of the trap beneath them, continued their advance, their turrets swiveling to track the fleeing humans. Kyle waited until they were in position, the generator directly beneath the lead walker. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hands were steady as he raised the remote trigger. "For Tarnak 4, he murmured and pressed the button. The explosion was a blinding flash of light, followed by a deafening roar that shook the ground. The generator's overload released a massive shockwave, tearing through the walkers with the force of a collapsing star. Their armor crumpled like paper, their limbs sheared off by the blast. The lead walker disintegrated entirely, its remains scattered across the battlefield in a fiery rain. The shockwave knocked Kyle off his feet, throwing him to the ground. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the dust began to settle, revealing the smoldering wreckage of the Imperial war machines. The walkers were gone, reduced to twisted metal and smoking debris. Vega and Maddox ran to Kyle, who was slowly pushing himself to his feet. He was battered and bloodied but alive. "You did it," Vega said, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and disbelief. "You actually did it?" Kyle managed a weak smile. "Told you we weren't out yet?" The three of them stood together, staring at the battlefield. The Empire's forces had been shattered, their might undone by the ingenuity and determination of a handful of humans armed with little more than grit and an ancient Gatling gun. For the first time in a long while, Tarnak 4 was quiet. The battle was over. And against all odds, humanity had won.